Victoria Langston sat in her spacious penthouse apartment, staring out at the glittering city skyline. Her father, Richard Langston, was one of the most powerful men in the business world, and his company, Novatech, dominated headlines for its cutting-edge technology and rapid growth. But lately, whispers had reached Victoria, whispers that painted a darker picture of the empire her family had built. Stories about unfair treatment of employees, shady deals, and even illegal activities swirled like storm clouds over Novatech's polished facade. Victoria wasn't naive. She knew running a global corporation came with challenges, but these rumors felt different. They gnawed at her conscience. She'd always been kept at arm's length from her father's work, attending charity galas and social events instead of board meetings. To Richard, she was his daughter first and foremost, not someone who needed to worry about the inner workings of his business. But Victoria wanted more than just surface-level involvement. She wanted to understand what really went on behind closed doors. One evening, after overhearing snippets of conversation between her father and his advisors during dinner, Victoria decided enough was enough. The hushed tones, the exchanged glances, it all pointed to something being hidden. Determined to uncover the truth, she hatched a daring plan. She would go undercover as an ordinary employee inside Novatech. Not as a high-ranking executive or manager, but as someone invisible, a cleaner. The idea thrilled and terrified her in equal measure. Victoria had never done manual labor in her life. Growing up surrounded by wealth and privilege meant she'd never scrubbed a floor or emptied a trash can. Yet, she knew this disguise would give her access to parts of the company no one else could see. Cleaners worked late into the night when offices were empty, leaving them free to observe things others might overlook. And so, with a mix of nerves and resolve, Victoria set her plan in motion. She dyed her blonde hair dark brown, swapped her designer clothes for thrift store finds, and adopted a new identity. Vicky, a quiet, hard-working woman looking for steady employment. Using a fake resume and references provided by a trusted friend, she applied for a position in Novatech's cleaning staff. When she received the call confirming her hiring, her heart raced. This was it, the beginning of her journey into the unknown. On her first day, Victoria arrived at Novatech headquarters wearing a plain uniform and carrying a bucket of cleaning supplies. As she stepped through the glass doors, she couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt. For years, she'd walked these halls as the CEO's daughter, greeted with respect and admiration. Now she blended seamlessly into the background, unnoticed and unremarked upon. It was both liberating and humbling. Her supervisor, a stern woman named Linda, gave her a quick tour and handed her a list of tasks. Victoria nodded eagerly, masking her anxiety with a bright smile. Her hands trembled slightly as she picked up a mop for the first time, but she refused to let herself falter. If she wanted answers, she had to commit fully to her role. By the end of her shift, her back ached and her palms were raw, but she felt a strange sense of accomplishment. For the first time in her life, she had earned something, not because of her last name, but because of her effort. As days turned into weeks, Victoria began adapting to her new reality. She learned how to navigate the labyrinthine corridors of the building, memorizing which floors housed which departments. She listened carefully to conversations around her, piecing together fragments of information. Slowly but surely, she started noticing cracks in Novatech's pristine image. Employees complained about long hours and low pay. Managers spoke dismissively of junior staff. And then there were the documents, sensitive papers left carelessly on desks, hinting at secrets buried deep within the company. Victoria knew she was onto something big, but she also realized that uncovering the truth wouldn't be easy. Every step forward brought new risks, and every discovery raised more questions. Still, she pressed on, driven by a growing determination to expose the darkness lurking beneath Novatech's shiny exterior. Little did she know, her journey was only just beginning. and the revelations awaiting her would shake the foundations of everything she thought she knew. Life as a cleaner was harder than Victoria had ever imagined. The first few nights were a blur of sore muscles, blisters, and frustration. She struggled to keep up with the demanding routine, mopping endless hallways, scrubbing stubborn stains off bathroom tiles, and hauling heavy bags of trash to the disposal area. Her coworkers watched her curiously at first, wondering how long this well-spoken newcomer would last in such a physically taxing job. But Victoria surprised them all. Despite her privileged background, she refused to give up. Every time she felt like quitting, she reminded herself why she was there: to uncover the truth about Novatek. Slowly but surely, Victoria began earning their trust. There was Maria, a kind-hearted single mother who worked tirelessly to provide for her 2 young children. Then there was Sam, an elderly man with a knack for telling funny stories about his days as a mechanic. And even Jake, a quiet yet observant guy who seemed to always be watching everyone around him. They welcomed Vicky into their small circle, sharing bits and pieces of their lives during late-night breaks in the staff lounge. Through these conversations, Victoria started hearing things that made her blood boil. Maria spoke bitterly about how Novatek had denied her fair wages despite years of loyal service. When she tried to negotiate better pay, she was abruptly fired without explanation. Only after months of struggling to find another job did Novatek rehire her, but at a lower salary. Sam chimed in with his own grievances, describing how younger employees were often overworked and underappreciated. He shook his head sadly, saying, "They treat us like we're invisible." Victoria listened intently, her heart aching for these people who worked so hard yet received so little in return. Their stories painted a picture far removed from the glossy image Novatek projected to the public. It wasn't just about low wages or poor working conditions. It was about feeling disposable, like cogs in a machine that cared nothing for their humanity. But it wasn't just talk. Victoria saw evidence of these injustices firsthand. Late one night, while cleaning the Human Resources Department, she stumbled upon folders filled with employee complaints. Some accused managers of harassment, others detailed unsafe working environments, and many pleaded for help that never came. Victoria's stomach churned as she flipped through the documents. These weren't isolated incidents. They were systemic issues ignored by those in power. Determined to dig deeper, Victoria started paying closer attention to the offices she cleaned. She noticed patterns in what employees left behind: crumpled sticky notes with cryptic messages, half-finished emails on unattended computers, and confidential reports carelessly scattered across desks. One evening, while tidying up the legal team's workspace, she found a memo detailing questionable financial practices. Another time, she overheard 2 executives arguing heatedly about covering up a data breach. Each discovery added another piece to the puzzle, confirming her suspicions that something rotten lay at the core of Novatek. Despite the mounting evidence, Victoria remained cautious. She knew she couldn't afford to raise suspicion. So she played her part perfectly, laughing at Sam's jokes, offering words of encouragement to Maria, and keeping her head down when Jake gave her probing looks. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone might catch on. Jake, in particular, seemed unusually watchful. He often lingered nearby when she lingered too long in certain areas, his sharp eyes following her every move. Even so, Victoria pressed on. The more she learned, the more determined she became to expose the truth. What started as a mission to satisfy her curiosity had evolved into something much bigger: a fight for justice. These were real people with real struggles, and they deserved better than what Novatek was giving them. As she mopped the floors and emptied trash bins each night, Victoria vowed to make sure their voices were heard, even if it meant risking everything she held dear. Little did she know, the darkest secrets of Novatek were still hidden in the shadows, waiting to be uncovered. And the closer she got to the truth, the more dangerous her journey would become. As the weeks went by, Victoria became more skilled at blending into her role as Vicky, the diligent cleaner. But with each passing night, She also grew bolder in her quest to uncover Novatech's secrets. Her curiosity had turned into a quiet obsession, driving her to push boundaries she never thought she'd cross. She knew the risks. Getting caught could mean losing everything, but the stakes felt too high to turn back now. One evening, while cleaning the executive floor, Victoria noticed something unusual. A conference room door had been left slightly ajar, and faint voices drifted out from inside. Normally, she would have ignored it and moved on, but something about the tone of the conversation made her pause. It wasn't just casual chatter. It was tense, urgent, and laced with frustration. Carefully, she inched closer, pretending to wipe down a nearby table while straining to listen. "I told you this wouldn't hold up," one voice hissed. "The numbers are all over the place. If anyone looks closely, we're done for." Another voice replied, calmer but equally serious. "Relax. No one's looking that hard. As long as we keep the board happy, they won't ask questions." Victoria's heart raced. She recognized the second speaker. It was Mr. Caldwell, one of the senior vice presidents. His name had come up in some of the documents she'd stumbled upon earlier, always tied to projects shrouded in secrecy. Whatever they were discussing, it wasn't good. Taking a deep breath, she leaned closer, catching snippets of their heated exchange. "It's not just the board we need to worry about," the first man continued. "What happens when someone outside finds out? The media? Or worse, the regulators?" "They won't," Caldwell snapped. "Not if we play our cards right. Just make sure those falsified reports stay buried where they belong." Falsified reports, buried evidence. Victoria's mind reeled. This wasn't just unethical behavior. It was outright fraud. Forcing herself to stay calm, she finished wiping down the table and quietly slipped away before they could notice her presence. Once safely out of earshot, she pulled out her phone and jotted down notes, careful to record every detail she could remember. But the discoveries didn't stop there. Over the next few nights, Victoria found herself drawn deeper into the web of deceit. In an empty office, she spotted a folder marked confidential lying forgotten on a desk. Glancing around to ensure no one was watching, she flipped it open. Inside were pages detailing illegal outsourcing practices, contracts signed with companies known for exploiting workers in developing countries. Another document outlined plans to cut corners on safety protocols to save costs, putting employees at risk. Each new revelation weighed heavily on Victoria, but it also fueled her determination. She began carrying a small notebook with her, jotting down key details whenever she found something suspicious. On nights when the offices were particularly chaotic, she even managed to snap quick photos of incriminating files using her phone. Every piece of evidence brought her closer to exposing the truth, but it also made her increasingly paranoid. What if someone discovered what she was doing? What if they traced it back to her? Her unease reached a peak one fateful night when she decided to venture onto the executive floor again. This time, she wasn't alone. Jake, the quiet coworker who always seemed to be watching her, appeared unexpectedly as she rifled through papers in an unattended cubicle. Startled, Victoria froze, her hands trembling as she tried to think of an excuse. "What are you doing here?" Jake asked, his voice low but firm. His eyes narrowed as he took in the scattered documents and her guilty expression. I forgot my mop," Victoria stammered, clutching the notebook tightly against her chest. "I thought I left it somewhere around here." Jake didn't look convinced. He stepped closer, his gaze piercing. "You've been acting strange lately, Vicky. Staying late, poking around places you shouldn't. You're not just here to clean, are you?" For a moment, Victoria thought her cover was blown. Her mind raced, searching for a way out. Then, summoning every ounce of courage, she met his stare. "Look, I don't know what you think you saw, but I'm just trying to do my job. Maybe you should focus on yours instead of accusing me." To her surprise, Jake hesitated. After a long, tense silence, he finally nodded. "Fine, but be careful. People around here don't take kindly to snoops." With that, He turned and walked away, leaving Victoria shaken but still standing. That encounter left her rattled, but it also served as a wake-up call. She realized she couldn't keep operating blindly. She needed a plan. The encounter with Jake left Victoria shaken but more determined than ever. She couldn't afford to let her guard down, not when she was so close to uncovering the full extent of Novitek's wrongdoing. Yet, as much as she tried to focus on her mission, doubts began creeping in. Was she truly prepared for what lay ahead? What if the truth was even darker than she imagined? And what would happen if her father found out? Despite her fears, Victoria pressed on, finding solace in the bonds she'd formed with her coworkers. Maria, in particular, had become a source of strength and inspiration. One evening, during a rare quiet moment in the break room, Maria opened up about her struggles in a way that struck a chord with Victoria. "You know," Maria said softly, cradling a cup of coffee in her hands, "when I first started here, I thought it was my chance to build a better life for my kids. But this place, it chews you up and spits you out. They don't care about us, Vicky. We're just numbers to them." Her words hung heavy in the air, and Victoria felt a lump rise in her throat. "I'm sorry you've had to go through that," she replied sincerely. "It's not fair." Maria shrugged, forcing a small smile. "Life isn't fair, but sometimes you just have to hope someone will stand up and say enough is enough." Victoria nodded, her resolve hardening. She realized that Maria wasn't just talking about herself. She was speaking for everyone who had been wronged by Novitek. These were the people Victoria was fighting for, and their courage gave her the strength to keep going. But not all relationships were as straightforward. Jake's suspicion lingered like a shadow over her every move. Though he hadn't confronted her again after their tense exchange, his watchful eyes followed her whenever they crossed paths. He seemed to sense that there was more to Vicky than met the eye, and his presence made Victoria increasingly uneasy. One night, while cleaning the IT department, Victoria stumbled upon something that sent chills down her spine. Hidden beneath a stack of outdated manuals was a folder labeled Project Eclipse. Curiosity got the better of her, and she cautiously opened it. Inside were detailed plans for a highly advanced surveillance system capable of monitoring not only competitors, but also ordinary citizens. The implications were staggering. This wasn't just corporate espionage. It was a blatant invasion of privacy on a massive scale. As Victoria flipped through the documents, her hands trembled with anger and disbelief. How could her father's company be involved in something so unethical? Before she could process what she'd found, footsteps echoed down the hallway. Panicking, she stuffed the folder back where she'd found it and grabbed her cleaning supplies, pretending to scrub a nearby desk as two IT employees walked in. Once they left, Victoria exhaled sharply, her mind racing. She knew she couldn't leave without evidence. Taking a deep breath, she snapped a few quick photos of the folder's contents before slipping away unnoticed. Her heart pounded as she returned to the safety of the cleaning closet, where she reviewed the images on her phone. Each page confirmed her worst fears. Novitek wasn't just bending rules. It was breaking them in ways that could have devastating consequences. Later that night, as she clocked out and headed home, Victoria replayed the events in her mind. She had the proof she needed, but now came the hardest part: deciding what to do with it. Exposing the truth meant risking everything: her family, her future, and possibly even her freedom. Yet staying silent felt impossible. The weight of responsibility bore down on her, leaving her torn between fear and determination. When she arrived at her apartment, she sat alone in the dim light, staring at the photos on her phone. For the first time since starting this journey, she allowed herself to cry. Tears streamed down her face as she grappled with the enormity of what she'd uncovered. But amidst the tears, a spark of defiance flickered within her. She couldn't turn back now, not when so many lives depended on her bravery. Little did Victoria know, her decision would set off a chain reaction that would change not only her life, but the entire trajectory of Novitek. The battle lines were drawn, and there was no going back. The next morning, Victoria knew she couldn't delay any longer. Armed with the evidence she had gathered, the photos of Project Eclipse, the falsified reports, and the employee complaints, she prepared herself for the hardest confrontation of her life. Facing her father. Her hands trembled as she scrolled through the files on her phone one last time, rehearsing what she would say. She wanted to be calm, rational, and firm, but her emotions were a storm inside her chest. When she arrived at her father's penthouse office, a space she had visited countless times before, it felt different now. The sleek furniture, the panoramic windows overlooking the city, and even the faint smell of leather and coffee seemed alien to her. This wasn't just her father's domain. It was the heart of Novatech, the epicenter of all the corruption she had uncovered. Richard Langston sat behind his massive desk, engrossed in paperwork, looking every bit the powerful CEO he was. When he looked up and saw Victoria standing there, his expression softened into a warm smile. "Victoria, what brings you here?" he asked, setting down his pen. "I didn't expect to see you today." For a moment, Victoria hesitated. Her father's voice was filled with affection, the same tone he used when asking about her day or offering advice. But beneath that warmth lay years of detachment, of keeping her at arm's length from his business. Taking a deep breath, she stepped closer, placing her phone on the desk between them. "I need to talk to you," she said, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. "It's important." Richard frowned, sensing the seriousness in her tone. "Of course. What is it?" Without another word, Victoria opened the gallery on her phone and began showing him the evidence. She explained everything. The illegal outsourcing, the falsified financial reports, the harassment complaints buried without action, and most chillingly, Project Eclipse. As each revelation unfolded, Richard's face transformed from confusion to disbelief, then to anger. This can't be right," he muttered, shaking his head. "Where did you get this? Who told you these things?" "No one told me," Victoria replied firmly. "I found it myself. I've been working undercover at Novatech as a cleaner for weeks. These aren't rumors, Dad. They're facts, and they're happening under your watch." Richard stared at her, stunned. For a long moment, silence hung heavy in the room. Then, slowly, his shock gave way to defensiveness. "You don't understand how this world works, Victoria. Running a company like Novatech isn't easy. Sometimes, difficult decisions have to be made for the greater good." "The greater good?" Victoria shot back, her voice rising. "Exploiting workers, spying on innocent people. Is that what you call the greater good? You're destroying lives, Dad. Real people are suffering because of the choices you've let happen." Her words struck a nerve. Richard leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples as if trying to process everything. Finally, he sighed deeply. "All right, let's say what you're saying is true. What do you want me to do about it? If we expose this, it won't just hurt Novatech. It'll ruin us. Our family, our legacy. Everything will be gone." "That's not my problem," Victoria said, her voice unwavering. "This isn't about protecting our name or saving face. It's about doing the right thing. If you won't take responsibility, then I will." Richard looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time in years. He saw the determination in her eyes, the fire that burned brighter than any fear. Slowly, reluctantly, he nodded. "Fine. I'll look into it. But promise me you won't go public, not yet. Let me handle this internally." Victoria hesitated. Part of her wanted to trust him, to believe that he could fix this. But she knew better. Too many secrets had already been swept under the rug. Still, she agreed. "For now." "Okay. But if you try to cover this up, I won't stay quiet. Not again." As she left the office, Victoria felt a mix of relief and dread. She had taken the first step toward exposing the truth, but the battle was far from over. Her father's reaction proved one thing: change wouldn't come easily. And as she walked out into the bright sunlight, She realized that the hardest part was still ahead. Exposing Novitek meant risking everything, including her relationship with her father. But no matter the cost, Victoria knew she couldn't turn back now. The days following her confrontation with her father were a blur of tension and uncertainty. Victoria waited anxiously for some sign that Richard was taking action, but nothing seemed to change at Novitek. The same executives continued their secretive meetings, the same unethical practices carried on unchecked, and the same employees remained trapped in cycles of exploitation. It became clear to Victoria that waiting for her father to act was futile. He wasn't going to risk his empire without a fight. Determined not to let the truth stay buried, Victoria made a decision. She would take matters into her own hands. She reached out to Maria, the coworker who had become like a sister to her during her time as Vicky. Over coffee at a quiet cafe far from Novitek's headquarters, Victoria explained everything. The evidence she had gathered, her confrontation with her father, and her plan to expose it all. Maria listened intently, her eyes widening with each revelation. When Victoria finished speaking, Maria sat quietly for a moment, processing what she had heard. Finally, she spoke. "You're risking everything to do this, aren't you?" Victoria nodded. "I have to. This isn't just about me. It's about everyone who's been hurt by Novitek. People like you." Maria hesitated, then smiled faintly. "If anyone can pull this off, it's you. Just be careful. They won't go down without a fight." With Maria's blessing, Victoria contacted a trusted journalist named Daniel Hayes, known for his investigative work exposing corporate corruption. She arranged a secret meeting late one evening in a dimly lit park, where she handed over copies of the evidence she had collected. Daniel listened carefully, asking probing questions to ensure he understood the gravity of the situation. By the end of their conversation, he promised to verify the information and publish the story, but warned Victoria that going public would put her directly in the line of fire. "I'm ready," Victoria said firmly, though her stomach churned with nerves. "This needs to come out." True to his word, Daniel worked quickly. Within days, the expose hit the headlines, sending shockwaves through the business world. The article detailed Novitek's illegal activities, including Project Eclipse, falsified financial reports, and systemic mistreatment of employees. Social media erupted with outrage as people shared the story, demanding accountability. Employees came forward with their own experiences, adding fuel to the growing firestorm. At Novitek, chaos ensued. Shareholders called emergency meetings, lawsuits piled up, and government agencies launched investigations. Richard Langston found himself under immense pressure from every direction. Reporters camped outside his office, cameras flashing as they shouted questions about his role in the scandal. For the first time in his career, the once unshakable CEO looked visibly shaken. One evening, Richard summoned Victoria to his penthouse office again. His usual confidence was gone, replaced by wariness and regret. "You did this," he said quietly, his voice tinged with both anger and sadness. "Do you realize what you've done? Everything I've built, it's falling apart." "And whose fault is that?" Victoria shot back, her tone firm but laced with emotion. "You had a chance to fix this, Dad. But instead, you chose to protect your reputation. I couldn't stand by and let that happen." Richard sighed deeply, running a hand through his graying hair. After a long pause, he admitted, "Maybe you're right. Maybe it's time for a change." To Victoria's surprise, he announced his decision to step down as CEO, effective immediately. He would appoint an interim leader committed to transparency and reform, while cooperating fully with the ongoing investigations. Though part of her felt guilty for the turmoil her actions had caused, Victoria knew it was necessary. As the dust began to settle, Novitek faced a reckoning unlike anything it had experienced before. Employees rallied around Victoria, thanking her for standing up when no one else would. Meanwhile, Richard retreated from the spotlight, grappling with the consequences of decades of unchecked power. For Victoria, the victory was bittersweet. She had exposed the truth, but the cost had been high. Her relationship with her father might never recover. Still, she refused to regret her choices. The battle wasn't over yet, but for the first time, she felt hope. Hope that Novatech could rebuild itself, not as a symbol of greed and corruption, but as a force for good. And she vowed to remain at the forefront of that fight, no matter what challenges lay ahead. In the weeks that followed the expose, Novatech became a battleground for change. The scandal dominated news cycles, with every twist and turn dissected by journalists, analysts, and the public. Employees who had once felt powerless found their voices, sharing stories of mistreatment and injustice on social media and in interviews. Protesters gathered outside Novatech's headquarters, holding signs that read "Justice for Workers" and "Transparency Now." It was clear that the company couldn't go back to business as usual. Victoria watched it all unfold with a mix of pride and apprehension. Her actions had sparked a movement, but she knew the road ahead would be long and difficult. Reforming a corporation as vast and deeply flawed as Novatech wouldn't happen overnight. Still, there were glimmers of hope. The interim leadership team, led by Sarah Chen, a former ethics consultant, pledged to root out corruption and rebuild the company from the ground up. They announced sweeping changes, fairer wages, stricter oversight of financial practices, and a commitment to ethical decision-making. For Victoria, the most rewarding part was seeing how her coworkers responded. Maria, inspired by Victoria's bravery, joined a newly formed employee advocacy group aimed at ensuring workers' rights were protected moving forward. "You showed us that we don't have to stay silent," Maria told Victoria one evening after a meeting. "Now it's our turn to make sure this never happens again." But not everyone welcomed the changes. Some executives fought back fiercely, accusing Victoria of betrayal and sabotage. Anonymous threats began appearing online, targeting her personally. One night, as she scrolled through comments on an article about the scandal, she stumbled upon a chilling message: "You'll regret crossing us." Though shaken, Victoria refused to let fear dictate her next move. She hired a security detail at the insistence of her friends and continued speaking out, determined not to back down. Her relationship with her father remained strained. Richard had retreated from public life, spending most of his time holed up in his penthouse or attending mandatory ethics seminars as part of the investigation into Novatech's practices. When Victoria visited him, their conversations were awkward and stilted. He still struggled to understand why she had risked everything to expose the company he had poured his life into building. "You could have handled this differently," he said during one particularly tense exchange. "There were other ways to address these issues without tearing everything apart. And how many times did you ignore those other ways?" Victoria countered, her voice firm but tinged with sadness. "This wasn't just about fixing problems, Dad. It was about accountability, for everyone, including you." Though their arguments often ended in silence, small moments of connection began to emerge. Richard occasionally asked about her plans for the future, genuinely curious about what drove her passion for justice. In return, Victoria shared more about her experiences working undercover, helping him see the human cost of his decisions. Their bond was fragile, but it was slowly beginning to mend. As the dust settled, Victoria decided to step away from her family's wealth and privilege entirely. She moved into a modest apartment downtown and dedicated herself to advocacy work, partnering with organizations fighting for workers' rights and corporate transparency. Her story inspired others to speak out against injustice, proving that even those born into privilege could use their position to uplift marginalized voices. By the end of the year, Novatech looked vastly different from the company it had been before the scandal. Under Sarah Chen's leadership, it implemented policies designed to prevent future abuses and foster a culture of integrity. While some critics argued that true transformation would take years, if not decades, Victoria saw progress, and that gave her hope. She knew the fight wasn't over. There would always be corporations willing to cut corners for profit, leaders who prioritized greed over humanity. But Victoria also knew something else, that courage, determination, and solidarity could create real change. And as she stood alongside Maria and other activists at a rally celebrating Novatek's reforms, she felt a deep sense of purpose. The battle scars were worth it. For them, for the future, and for the belief that doing the right thing mattered more than anything else. Months turned into a year, and Victoria Langston's life had transformed in ways she never could have predicted. The scandal at Novatek became a turning point not just for the company but for her as well. What started as a personal quest to uncover the truth had grown into a mission that inspired countless others to demand accountability from powerful institutions. Victoria was no longer just the CEO's daughter. She was a symbol of courage and integrity, a voice for those who had been silenced for too long. Novatek itself underwent a remarkable transformation under Sarah Chen's leadership. The company implemented strict ethical guidelines, established an independent oversight board, and launched initiatives to support employees' mental health and financial stability. Projects like Eclipse were dismantled entirely, replaced by programs focused on using technology for social good. Slowly but surely, Novatek began rebuilding its reputation, not as a corporate giant obsessed with profits, but as a responsible entity committed to making a positive impact. For Victoria, walking away from her family's wealth was both liberating and challenging. Living in her modest apartment taught her lessons about resilience and gratitude she'd never learned in her penthouse days. She threw herself into advocacy work, traveling across the country to speak at conferences, lead workshops, and meet with activists fighting similar battles. Her story resonated deeply with people from all walks of life, showing them that privilege could be used as a tool for change rather than a barrier to it. Her relationship with her father remained complicated, but it grew stronger over time. Richard, once so consumed by his empire, found solace in spending quiet evenings with Victoria, discussing books, politics, and their shared hopes for the future. He admitted to her one evening, "I didn't understand you before. I thought I was protecting our legacy. But now I see. You were protecting something far more important." Though he still struggled with guilt over his role in Novatek's past misdeeds, Richard worked tirelessly to make amends. He donated large portions of his fortune to charities supporting workers' rights and education, earning back some measure of respect from the public. Watching him evolve gave Victoria a renewed sense of hope, not just for their family, but for humanity's ability to grow and change. As for Victoria, she embraced her new identity wholeheartedly. She founded an organization called Voices Unseen, dedicated to empowering marginalized workers and holding corporations accountable for unethical practices. Through Voices Unseen, she partnered with journalists, lawyers, and activists to shine a light on injustices hidden within industries worldwide. Her efforts earned her recognition, including awards and invitations to speak on global stages, but what mattered most to her was the difference she made in people's lives. One day, while attending a community event hosted by Voices Unseen, Victoria spotted Maria in the crowd. Now working as a supervisor at Novatek, Maria approached her with tears in her eyes. "Thank you," she said simply, pulling Victoria into a tight hug. "Because of you, my kids have a better future." That moment reminded Victoria why she had risked everything. It wasn't for fame or glory. It was for moments like this, where someone felt seen, heard, and valued. As she looked around the room filled with smiling faces, she realized how far they had all come together. But Victoria knew the fight wasn't over. Corporations would always find new ways to exploit loopholes, and greed would continue to tempt those in power. Yet, she also knew that every victory, no matter how small, brought them closer to a fairer world. With each speech she gave, each policy she helped shape, and each person she inspired, she planted seeds of change that would grow long after she was gone. The final chapter of Victoria's journey wasn't defined by endings, but by beginnings. She walked forward confidently, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Her heart was lighter now, knowing she wasn't alone. She had allies, friends, and a movement behind her. Together, they proved that even the darkest secrets couldn't withstand the power of truth, unity, and unwavering determination. And so Victoria stepped into the unknown, her head held high and her spirit unbreakable. The road ahead was uncertain, but she welcomed it with open arms. After all, she had already shown the world what was possible when one person dared to stand up and speak out for what was right.